still hear you.
I don't hear you. Pardon.
Okay, Muscanu, can you mute him from your side? So it's going to be 2000, around 3,000 words. I expect it to be 3,000 words. We've already the exegetical steps that I expect you to execute. So I encourage you to start working on it if you haven't started already. As I've said, I am willing to give you my feedback if you send me the first few steps, and I can point you to the right direction, to the right kind of resources, and all of that. But I do encourage you to start working on it. It's going to be the primary way in which I intend to evaluate your performance in the course. So I encourage you to start working on it. Your second assignment is going to be a set of lab reports, today's discussion, and today's assigned reading. So after class, you are expected to practice what we discuss by working on a homework you can find on the book by Bloomberg and others. Is a book called Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. It has an accompanying workbook. I have copied that in the folder. You can find it. It's titled Introduction to Biblical Interpretation Workbook. So it's a set of questions. Basically, it's a workbook. It's intended to help you practice the theoretical aspect of the class discussion. So we will talk about how to interpret Old Testament narrative today, and I expect you to practice what we discussed today by doing that homework, Maletra. So this is going to you will find it on the workbook. This is going to be your lab report for today. It's going to be on the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. And after reading it, it asks you a set of questions. It asks you about plot, about characters. We'll talk about these terms today, and you are supposed to practice what we discussed. And if you have lingering questions, you simply have to go back to the book, not the workbook, but the actual book, and read from page 430 to 31. So it's quite easy, it's straightforward, and the questions are not that many. You can do it in a matter of hours. So I want you to do that, and I expect to receive this before next week, same time. So feel free to send me starting from today up to next week, but it should be before class. It should be before next week's class. And I don't I really encourage you to send me within the framework. If you send it to me, really defeat the purpose of the homework, which is for you to practice and crystallize what we discussed today. So as time goes by, the concepts, the discussion will become vague, and it won't really help you to crystallize the theoretical aspect. So I intend to be strict about it. Yes, it's here, Asir. It's a book called Introduction to Biblical Interpretation Workbook. So you'll find it there. And as I've said, you should send it to me before next week's class. Okay. After that, I don't really expect to receive any emails. So don't send them if you can't manage to do it within this week. I won't be grading them later, so don't do that. Other than that, there is also a reading log that I expect you to read. you will submit the reading log on the final day of class. It's also going to be a hard deadline. But more importantly, your final exam will be based on the reading log. So if you are not reading the reading log, it means you're not also ready for your final exam later. So I encourage you to start reading the reading log as well. It's not I've double checked it. It's not that many really. If you had started reading from week one, it's really manageable. And since this is a master's level education, reading really is a crucial aspect of your learning. So uh, I encourage you to start reading if you haven't begun already. It's imperative that you do that. Doing that will give you two advantages. You will you will gain some point for the reading itself, and by reading you're also preparing yourself for the final exam, which will entirely be based on reading. So for those reasons I encourage you to start reading. So the final exam will be out of 13, and it will also be uh, probably on the last day of class on the 29th of December, but we will figure that out as time approaches. Okay, so let's revise what we discussed last time and proceed to today's discussion. What do you remember from our discussion last week? What did we talk about? Do you have any questions regarding that? Is there questions that arose as you reflected on it this past week? What do you remember? Anyone? Talked about Old Testament law, right? What do you remember about that? What did we say are some of the best practices to follow in trying to interpret biblical law, Old Testament law? Okay, just to recap, uh, yeah, we talked about Old Testament law and how to approach it when trying to interpret it, when trying to exegete it, and apply it in our context. Uh, as I've said last week, uh, we are trying to deal with the biblical material on a genre by genre basis. This doesn't mean that the exegetical steps that we discuss, it's the exegetical steps stop applying when it comes to a certain genre or when it comes to biblical law or OT narrative or things like that. Just simply means that each genre requires a certain nuance, each genre requires a certain specific step. So the exegetical steps we discussed are the general principles that we should always follow in trying to interpret a biblical passage we're interested in. So the eight exegetical steps, things like establishing the text, that's mini textual criticism, and demarking an exegetical unit, or investigating context, be it historical or literary context, or investigating important word studies, and verse by verse analysis. All that they always apply. They always apply. So you should treat them as you can see them as foundational for biblical exegesis. So whether you are dealing with OT law, or whether you are dealing with Old Testament narrative, or dealing with uh, poetry or wisdom literature, or Testament epistles, even Apocalypse, those kind of things still apply. They are like the basics, okay? So think of them as a grammar of hermeneutics. So whether you are writing, for example, a poetry in Amharic or a fiction or a non-fiction, you will follow the basic grammar of Amharic, right? You will follow the grammatical rules, you will follow the alphabet and all that, at least for the most part. So those steps are like that for hermeneutics. They are like the syntax of hermeneutics. They always apply. They are always important. So they you should always keep those on the back of your mind when we talk about a genre-focused approach. But those general principles, they have to be nuanced depending on the biblical material we're dealing with, specifically depending on the genre we're dealing with. For example, Old Testament law has its own literary and theological considerations that we should respect in order to make the best out of it. And those considerations doesn't always, for example, apply when it comes to Old Testament narrative aspect. So each biblical genre requires its own rules ማለት ነው. Each because as we said, genre is a literary type. It's a each it's a convention. It sets expectation. So it's a pattern that the text follows. Right? So it's important that we nuance those approaches, those general principles, depending on the biblical genre we are dealing with. So with this in mind, we talked about Old Testament law last week. We discussed that we first defined it properly. We said that when we talk about law, we are not talking about the Torah as a whole. When we say biblical law, we are not talking about the Torah as a whole, the Pentateuch as a whole. That is the 5 books of Moses. They are not all a set of commandments, right? There is narrative in them. There is prophetic material in them. And there is poetry in them. So when we say law as a genre, we are not talking about the Torah as a whole or the 5 books as a whole. Rather, we are talking about the stipulation aspects of the Mosaic covenant. We're talking about the set of commandments that you find in the Old Testament. So we basically divided them by two. We said that there are apodictic laws in which an absolute commandment is given, something like do not kill or do not steal, do not lie, which is not based on case, which is not based on a conscience. We call that apodictic, and there are what we call casuistic laws, which are case by case laws. So they always do, they don't apply in every case. For example, there are architectural laws that only apply when someone is building a house, right? So and there are, for example, laws that assume a set of circumstances in order for them to be true. So we call those laws casuistic laws. So when we talk about biblical law, we are talking about those laws. We're not talking about, for example, we're not talking about commandments transmitted in a form of narrative. Rather, we are talking about these separate commandments. So the first thing to keep in mind when dealing with Old Testament law is to remember that to remember that the Old Testament laws, Old Testament commandments are the stipulation aspect of the Mosaic covenant. That is, we need to have a theological consideration when dealing with Old Testament laws. When trying to interpret, exegete, and apply Old Testament laws, we need a certain theological consideration. We need to take a certain theological consideration, or you can call that a theological context, for example. We need to understand that the law existed, the commandments existed within a broad narrative, within the covenant of Israel, within the Mosaic covenant. So you can't try to interpret the Mosaic laws without taking the covenant into consideration. The covenant is a necessary theological consideration in order to interpret the Old Testament commandments ማለት ነው. Hence, it's imperative that you understand that the Old Testament laws exist within the covenant framework. So the Mosaic laws are given within that covenantal framework. So the logical thing that follows is that since the Mosaic covenant is not functional for us today, not only today, but since it was not functional for us even back then, since the Mosaic covenant is exclusively given for the Israelites, it was an ethnic based covenant, right? The Mosaic covenant was given to the Israelites. It was given with the purpose of making them a separate nation, a holy nation, right? So the Mosaic covenant was not given for Gentiles. So that was back then. But even now, even for the Jews today, the Mosaic covenant, at least from a Christian perspective, is not functional, right? The covenant that Christ Jesus inaugurated has made that covenant expire, right? The writer of Hebrews, the author of Hebrews, tells us that that covenant has become old. So the Mosaic covenant was was never functional for Gentiles, and it's especially not functional for us Christ believers. Hence, it would be theologically wrong to treat those commandments as binding on Christians. So they are not binding to us. They are not binding in a sense. They do not put obligation on us since we are not part of the covenant, right? The land of Canaan was not promised to us. Uh, and the temple and all that, they were not given to us. So the Mosaic covenant doesn't directly apply to us. Hence, the stipulation part also doesn't directly relate to us. Hence, we need to take that into consideration when interpreting these laws. We need to understand that these laws in any shape or form does not directly apply to Christians. Hence, we need a different theological perspective when reading Old Testament commandments. So we need we talked we discussed that rather it's important to focus on the purpose of each commandment and investigate why they were given and investigate why what kind of circumstance is being promoted and investigate what those commandments tell us about the God we worship, right? The God of the New Testament, the God of Jesus Christ, the God we worship today, is the same God. Uh, is the God that gave those commandments to the Israelites. Hence, we can assume that his character, his priorities, and the kind of community he wants to create is reflected on those commandments. So, although those commandments are not directly binding to us, they can tell us a lot about the nature of God, and they can tell us a lot about what kind of community he wants to create. So, in that sense, we can read them and we can try to apply them. So, whenever we are trying to apply the Old Testament laws, we rather than focusing on the literal sense or the direct commandments on us, we rather should focus on the purpose, on what they tell us about God and about the environment that He wants to create. And we will try to imitate that in a Christian way, ማለት ነው. In addition, we also talked about the historical context behind these commandments, even though they were given directly from God, even though the Old Testament tells us that the Sinai was a context, we need to understand that they were given within a historical context, within a historical phenomenon. Hence, the commandments, some of the commandments, for example, they were they are presented in a historically encapsulated manner. So we need to understand that historical context in order to understand the core of the commandments. So, for example, we talked about commandments like not boiling a goat in its mother's milk. In order to understand those commandments, we need to understand the history behind it, right? So we also need to appreciate that these commandments are historical. They are not always transcendental. They rather are they have an immanent aspect to them as well. They are rooted in history. So it's important that we understand the history of the ancient Near East, that is the history of Israel and its neighbors, in order to understand and appreciate them better. In addition, we also talked about when dealing with the historical context, we should give a special attention to the polemical context as well. These commandments were used to promote the monotheist phase of Israel and to attack uh, other idols that were prominent in Israel's neighbors. So, for example, the example I just gave can be seen polemically as well. It's a way of attacking a common ritualistic behavior that was everywhere in the ancient Near East. So we need to understand that these commandments that they have a polemical context as well. So we need to focus on these issues when dealing with Old Testament commandments ብለን This is just to recap, to remind you what we discussed and to give a very brief introductory note to those who were not present last week. So let's talk about the Old Testament narrative today. Another genre, another text type we find in the Old Testament is what we call a narrative. Any questions regarding Old Testament law before beginning Old Testament narrative? Yes, as well. Go ahead as well, unmute yourself and ask away. Asfaw, I cannot hear you if you're speaking.
አስፋው በስህተት ይመስለኛል ብዙ ጊዜ ይነካል።
Okay.
It seems mistake.
Let's talk about OT narratives then. So the greatest portion of the Old Testament is in narrative form. So narrative, as you know, is a material purpose. Yes, as far. If you are having difficulty as far, you can type it in the chat and I can read it. So the greatest portion of the Old Testament is in narrative form. There are actually two major narrative blocks in the Old Testament. There are two major narrative blocks in the Old Testament. The first one is starting from Genesis up to Second Kings. It's sometimes called the primary history. And there is another narrative that starts from Chronicles and goes up to Nehemiah, and it's called Chronicler's history. So the first one, pretty much what's called primary history, that's from Genesis to Second Kings. It starts from the creation of the world, and it tells us the story of God, the story of Israel up to the exile. And the chronicler, there is an overlap with the primary history, but it tells us the story from a sort of exilic perspective or a post-exilic perspective. So we have two major narrative blocks in the Old Testament. The first one is called the primary history, and the second one is called the chronicler's history. But it doesn't mean that there is no narrative elsewhere. The prophetic books also contain narrative, as you know. For example, Esther is presented to us in narrative form. The book of Ruth is presented to us in a narrative form. And we also find narrative, for example, in the first 6 chapters of the prophet Daniel. Hence, to fully comprehend and appreciate the Hebrew scriptures, it's really imperative that we understand how narrative works. Narrative is a very important aspect of the Bible, right? The way God chose to communicate to us, especially in the Old Testament, is not really through a set of prepositions or a set of arguments. We don't really find that in the Old Testament. The argumentative elements can be found, of course. Okay, we can talk about that later as well. In the Old Testament, we don't really find an argumentative kind of form of speaking. The first reason for it is that it's an ancient document, and we know that the ancients essentially were storytellers. Hence, they opted to tell us uh, their experience with God through a narrative, right? The New Testament is a bit different from this, especially the epistles. They are rhetorically designed, or we can treat them as essentially an argumentative documents, but the Old Testament is for the most part presented to us in a narrative form. The way God chose to reveal Himself to us really is through a narrative, right? It's a meta narrative, right? God, the way God tried to communicate with us, so the way the Bible is designed is in a narrative format that starts from creation, and even in Testament that ends with a new creation, right? It really is one major big narrative. It's one major big story, right? That starts from the creation of the world, and that ends with a new creation. So the narrative is really important, and it's the backbone of the Bible. So it's important that we understand how narrative works. So what the first thing is to really define what a narrative is. Uh, in common usage, the terms narrative and story are used interchangeably. We can use them interchangeably. I think in Amharic, ታሪክ ስቶሪን ታሪክ ወይም ትረካ ነገር ተብሎ ናሬቲቭን ግን ትርክት የሚባለው መሰለኝ። ዜና ላይ ምናምን እንደዚህ አይነት ትርክት አያስፈልግም ምናምን ሲባል ይሰማላል። that's narrative. So technically they are different, story and narrative. Story really is an actual account or a historical account of what happened. Story is what really happened, but a narrative is a particular retelling of what actually happened. For example, an event might happen around your home, so that event has happened, and you might have witnessed that, and another people might also have witnessed that. So you might choose to present that story or what happened from your own perspective, and another person will present that story from his own perspective. Hence, we will not have two stories, technically speaking. We will have one story and two narratives. So a narrative is a particular retelling of a story, or a narrative is a story presented to us from a certain perspective. That perspective could be historical, that could be philosophical, and as in the case of the New Testament, it could be a theological point of view or a theological perspective. So a story is more abstract than narrative. The story, as far as one can discover it, it tries to recount what actually happened. What actually happened. But narrative, there is always interpretation involved in narrative. For example, you can see this. We can witness it in our day-to-day life. For example, if you have a habit of listening to the news in Ethiopia, an event is the same event would be presented to us uh, differently depending on the source you are listening to, right? The state news will present it to us from their own perspective. They will have their own biases. They will rearrange it in a way that fits the narrative that they want to push. And for example, another news stations, opposition news stations would also present that story, but from their own perspective, right? The story that actually happened is the same, but the way it is presented, the element of the story that is being emphasized, and the translation or the interpretation that is given to the actual story will be different. So the same story could have different narratives, etc. So story and narrative is uh, a different thing. They are not always the same. You have to keep this in mind when it comes to the Bible as well. You have to for example, if you are interested in Christian apologetics, and if you read um, books, in apologetics-oriented books, you might notice a tendency of conflating story or history and narrative. Uh, there is history in the Bible, and the Bible, in fact, claims to be a historically rooted Bible, and this is especially true when it comes to the New Testament, in which the major theological phenomenon of the New Testament, the resurrection of Christ, is presented to us as being historical, right? It's deeply rooted in history. So there definitely is history in the Bible. But also have to realize that the way this history is presented to us is through narrative. They are not giving us mere historical accounts. They are not for the sake of not trying to be objective, or they were not trying to we call a pure historian or a biasless historian in modern senses. They were not interested in that. Their prime concern seems to be theological. The way they tell us history, the way they tell us story, is from the perspective of theology. It's a theological narrative. For example, think of the creation account in Genesis. They are actually trying to tell us what actually happened, but they are presenting it in a theological interpretation, in a theological perspective. Not only the creation account, but every account, starting from the exile. For example, think of the exile. The exile, the exile happened. So there are you can have two different interpretation of the exile. The first one is to take a political approach, and the Babylonian kingdom is growing. Babylonian kingdom is is integrating every other smaller nation in its surrounding. So since the Babylonian kingdom is growing, and since Israel is a small nation, it's only natural that the Babylonians invade Israel, right? Because they are an ancient empire, and ancient empires expand. It's in their nature. So we have to understand that the time there were no such thing as state nations back then, right? There was no such thing as sovereign respected boundary or things like that, as we moderns understand it. Uh, in order to find resources, in order to expand, in order to grow nations, strong nations, they needed to expand, they needed to invade. So expansion and invasion was normal. Hence, as the Babylonians harness power, as they gathered strength, it's only natural that they decided to invade Israel, just like they invaded other nations as well. So you can take a political approach to this event and say that the Babylonians, they were growing in power, and they had political needs, they had economic needs, hence they were surrounding their neighbors, and Israel was no different. Israel was also invaded. Hence, you can understand the exile from this political perspective. So this is a political interpretation of what actually happened. But the biblical writers do not emphasize on this aspect. They rather focus on a theological perspective, right? For them, the reason they were invaded, the reason the exile happened, was not that the Babylonians were simply too strong and simply too powerful not to invade, not to expand. Rather, for them, the theological explanation or the theological rationale for the exile was the sin of Israel, right? For them, Israel was sinful. They sinned against God. Hence, they were invaded by the Babylonians. They went to exile. So for this historical account, they are giving us a theological understanding, right? They are giving us a historical understanding. So this is narrative. So you have to understand that what we find in the Old Testament, not only in the Old Testament, in the New Testament as well, is narrative, not story, not history. It's not always history. Uh, So this doesn't mean that there is no history behind them, or this doesn't mean that the biblical writers invented the story or things like that. No, it simply means that uh, they had a perspective from which they were writing that specific story. So we have to understand that what we find in the Bible is not mere history, or it's not a history textbook. It rather is a history presented to us from a theological perspective. For example, another example for you to understand what I'm saying is think of the case of King Cyrus. You do remember King Cyrus, right? Cyrus, the king of the Persians, he is the one who decided to return the exiles back to Israel, right? So the way Isaiah presents King Cyrus to us, for us, is that he was a servant of Yahweh, right? He was a servant of God. ባሪያዬ ይለዋል አይደለ? ቂሮስን. So Isaiah presents to us Cyrus as being the servant of God and returning the exiles back home and allowing the temple to be rebuilt and all that. So for Isaiah, what's being emphasized is that Cyrus is being used by God in order to fulfill his purposes. But there are other archaeological and historical documents that talk about the same event, in which we find the perspective the Babylonians took about this, the perspective actually Cyrus took in this historical account. So from Cyrus's perspective, he was being a shrewd politician. So I'm talking about a certain archaeological finding called let me see if I can find it here, called Cyrus's cylinder የሚባል. So okay, just give me 1 minute. Let me open it up for you. Okay, let me change my screen. Can you see this? So this is an archaeological finding called Cyrus's cylinder that tells us the decree of Cyrus the Great to return captive peoples to back to their native lands, and this is in line with what we find in Ezra, in the book of Ezra as well, and in the prophets as well. So it in a way shows that the biblical account is essentially true, that Cyrus actually returned captives back to their native lands. But what makes this interesting is that it actually is so half of this cylinder talks about actually give us a first-hand account of what Cyrus said about the event. So from this we learned that Cyrus not only allowed the Israelites to go back to their land and build the temple, but he gave that invitation to every captive people group. So, as I've said, Babylon took to exile not only Israel but other neighboring countries as well. So it's part of their expansion. It's part of their political plan in order to make sure that subdued people do not rebel. They would take important figures from each nation, and they will take those people to exile, just like we find in the book of Daniel, right? The best and the brightest were selected from Israel, and they were taken to Babylon. So Israel was not the only one to be exiled. Not only that, Israel was not the only one to be allowed to return as well. Rather, every captive people group was allowed to return. And this was Cyrus's political plan in a way, as a way of making sure that uh, people people actually obey him, that this people group actually continues their faithfulness to him. He took a political plan and allowed them to return. So he doesn't do that. He didn't give this privilege specifically for the Israelites. He didn't allow this specifically because he felt obliged to the God of the Israelites. Rather, he rather allowed every other people group to return to their own land and to return worshipping their own gods. So you see what I'm talking about, right? From Cyrus's perspective and from the Babylonians' perspective, the return of the exiles, the exiles not only Israel but every exile, was a political plan, was a shrewd plan. It was in a way a form of diplomacy, right? But for the Israelites, they understood that even theologically. For them, it was God acting on their behalf. For them, it was God using Cyrus in order to fulfill what the prophets have said before them. Hence, we find the same story, but it's presented to us in two different narratives. The story is the same, but the narrative is different ማለት ነው. So this is what we find in the Bible. This is what we call a narrative account of history ማለት ነው. So we need to realize that the Bible is not a mere bias-free historical record, and it would be wrong to treat it as such. But rather should be treated as a narrative with a theological agenda, with a theological perspective ማለት ነው. If we fail to do that, we will fail to appreciate the theological aspect of it ማለት ነው. So that's why, for example, we can apply narrative criticism to it. We can. So if it was mere history, if it was mere historical account, it would be wrong, for example, to treat it as a narrative and to try to apply narrative criticism to it, to try to understand the plot or the characterization or the setting and things like that. But since it is a narrative, since it's an interpreted story, we can apply narrative criticism to it ማለት ነው. So is it clear what I've been saying so far? ስለዚህ አንድ አይነት ኢቨንት ሁለት ሶስት አይነት በሁለት በሶስት በአራት አይነት ናሬቲቭ ፕሬዘንት ሊደረግልን ይችላል እያልኳቸው መጽሐፍ ቅዱስ ላይ የምናገኛቸው ኢቨንቶች የሆኑት ነገሮች የሆነውን ነገር ያለምንም ኢንተርፕሬቴሽን ያለምንም ስነ መለኮታዊ ፍሬምወርክ ዝም ብሎ ለታሪክ ተብለው ሪከርድ የተደረጉ ሳይሆን የሆኑትን እውነቶች በስነ መለኮታዊ መነጽር ተረድተው ያስቀመጡልን ነገር ነው እያልኳቸው። ይሄ ማለት ታሪክ አይደሉም ማለት አይደለም፣ ወይም ልክ አይደሉም ማለት አይደለም። ራዘር የወሰዱት የናሬቲቭ ቴክኒክ አለ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ የቂሮስን ምሳሌ ያልኳችሁ ቂሮስ ኢን ዘ ኦልድ ተስታመንት ፕሬዘንት የሚደረግልን የእግዚአብሔር አገልጋይ ተብሎ ነው ፕሬዘንት የሚደረግልን። ከዛ በኋላ እስራኤልን እንድትመለስና አምላኳ እንድታመልክ እንደፈቀደ ተደርጎ ነው ፕሬዘንት የሚደረግልን እና ያንን የሚያደርገው ደግሞ በቃ እግዚአብሔር እየጠቀምበት ስለሆነ እንደዛ ተደርጎ ነው ፕሬዘንት የሚደረግልን። ስለዚህ እሱ እውነት ነው። ሴም ታይም ደግሞ ስለ ቂሮስ የሚናገሩ የባቢሎኒያን ሶርሶች ደግሞ ቂሮስ ለራሱ ለፖለቲካል ጎል ብሎ በምርኮ የተወሰዱ ሰዎችን ሁሉ እንዲመለሱ እንደፈቀደ ስለዚህ እስራኤል ብቻ ሳትሆን የተመለሰችው በባቢሎን መስፋፋት ጊዜ ሁሉ የተወሰዱ ወደ ባቢሎን የመጡ ፒፕል ግሩፖች ሁሉ ተመልሰው የራሳቸውን አምላክ እንዲያመልኩ እንደፈቀደ እሱም ያህዌን የሚያመልኩ ነው ሳይሆን ለራሱ ፖለቲካል አጀንዳ ብለው ማለት ነው እንደዛ አድርጎ እንደፈቀደ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ይህንን ሁነት እስራኤላይት ደግሞ ከእግዚአብሔር አንጻር ከስነ መለኮታቸው አንጻር ተረድተውት እግዚአብሔር ቃሉ እንደፈጸመበት እንደ እግዚአብሔር አገልጋይ አድርገው ፕሬዘንት አድርገውልናል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ እያንዳንዱ ታሪክ በትርክት በናሬቲቭ መልኩ ነው ፕሬዘንት የተደረገልን። ስለዚህ ስነ መለኮታዊ ትርክት ነው እያልኳችሁ ነው የምናገኘው መጽሐፍ ቅዱሳችን ላይ። ግልጽ ነው ሞገስ? ግልጽ ነው? ያንተን ፊት ብቻ ስለሆነ እያዩ ያለሁት። ታንክ ዩ።
ግልጽ ነው።
ስለዚህ ናሬቲቭ ከሌሎች የስነ ጽሁፍ ጀነሮች ለየት የሚያደርገው ነገር እንዳለ ሪላይዝ ማድረግ አለብን። የመጀመሪያው ካራክተሮች ይኖራሉ ናሬቲቭ ውስጥ ፕላይ የሚያደርጓል ገጸ ባህሪያት የሚባሉት ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ አሁን ስለ ታሪካዊ ኢቨንቶች ያወራን ገጸ ባህሪ መቼት ምናምን ስንል ውሸት ተረት ነው እያልን ሳይሆን የሆነው ነገር ከሆነ ፐርስፔክቲቭ ፕሬዘንት ስለተደረገልን ነው። ስለዚህ ናሬቲቭ ነው ስቶሪው በናሬቲቭ መልኩ ፕሬዘንት ስለተደረገልን ነው እንደዚህ እያልን የምናወራው ማለት ነው። ይህንን ሪያላይዝ ማድረግ ያስፈልጋል። ገጸ ባህሪዎቹ ምናምን ስንል ውሸት ነው ወይም ተረት ነው እያልን ሳይሆን የሆነው ነገር በቴዎሎጂካል ናሬቲቭ ነው ፕሬዘንት የተደረገልን ኦተርስ ኮሸሱ ነው ያደረጉልን። ስለዚህ በእንደዛ መልኩ ማውራት ይቻላል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ከሌሎች ቢብሊካል ጀነርስ በተለየ መልኩ ናሬቲቭ ካራክተሮች ይኖሩታል፣ ስቶሪ አለው፣ ፕሎት አለው። ስለዚህ እነዚህ አይነት ነገሮችን አይደንቲፋይ በማድረግ ማጥናት ነው ፕሮፐርሊ እንድንረዳው የሚያደርገን ማለት ነው የናሬቲቭ ኤሌመንቶች። ሞገስ ካን ዩ ሚት ዮርሰልፍ? ሚዩት አድርገው ራስህ። ከዛ በተጨማሪ ደግሞ ናሬተር እናገኛለን። ናሬቲቭ ላይ ናሬት የሚያደርግልን ሰው እናገኛለን አይደለ? ዘ ናሬተር ኢዝ ኢምፖርታንት። ናሬተሩ ማለት የሚሆነውን የሚነግረን ማለት ነው። ለምሳሌ ቲንክ ኦፍ ለምሳሌ የጀነሲስ 12 አስቡ እና የአብርሃምና የይስሐቅን ታሪክ እሱን የሚተርክልን ሰው ለምሳሌ ፍሮም ሂስ ኦን ፐርስፔክቲቭ ነው ሆኖ ነው የሚነግረን አይደል? አብርሃም በልቡ የሚያስበውን ያውቃል፣ ሳራም በድብቅ የምታደርገውን ያውቃል። ሁሉንም የሚያውቅ ሆኖ የሚሆነውን ነገር ሁሉ ፉል ፒክቸር የሚሰጠን ናሬተር አለ። ስለዚህ ታሪክን ከናሬተሩ ፐርስፔክቲቭ ነው እኛ የምናነበው ማለት ነው። ናሬቲቭን ከናሬተሩ ፐርስፔክቲቭ ለምሳሌ የኢዮብን አካውንት አስቡት። ኢዮብ የሚሆነውን ነገር አያውቅም። እኛ ግን የምናነበው ሰዎች ሰማይ የሚሆነውን እናውቃለን፣ እግዚአብሔርና ሰይጣን የሚያወሩትን እናውቃለን። ስለዚህ ሁሌ ፍሮም ዘ ናሬተር ፐርስፔክቲቭ ነው የምናነበው ማለት ነው ሁሌ። ስለዚህ in order to understand it better, to understand the text better, you have to make sure that you are interpreting it from the narrator's perspective. ለምሳሌ የአብርሃምና የይስሐቅን ታሪክ እያነበባችሁ ስትደመድሙ የናሬቲቭ ሚኒንግ ላይ ስትደርሱ ከአብርሃም ፐርስፔክቲቭ መሆን አይችልም፣ ወይም ከይስሐቅ ፐርስፔክቲቭ ሊሆን አይችልም። የመጨረሻው ፐርስፔክቲቭ ይልቁንስ ናሬተሩ ከሚነግረን ፐርስፔክቲቭ ነው የሚያልቀው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ናሬተሩ የሚነግረን ነገር ሲሪየስሊ መውሰድ አለብን። ናሬቲቭ ስናነብ ለምሳሌ የጀነሲስ 12 የአብርሃምን ኬዝ ያልኳችሁ ላይ በናሬተር ሲጀምር ናሬት የሚያደርግልን ካራክተር ሲጀምር እግዚአብሔርም አብርሃምን ፈተነው ብሎ ይጀምርልናል። ስለዚህ ቴሊንግ አስ ዛት ዘ ሬስት ኦፍ ዘ ናሬቲቭ is to be understood within that framework በቴምፕቴሽን በመፈተን በቴስት ፍሬምወርክ ውስጥ ነው እንዲነበብ የተገባው ነው ማለት ነው። ያ ፍሬምወርክ ፈተና ነው እያለ ነው። ስለዚህ ፈተና ነው ብሎ ነግሮን ስለጀመረ እኛ በምንደርስበት ድምዳሜ የምንፈታበት የምንተረጉምበት አተረጓጓም ናሬተሩ ከሚነግረን ነገር ጋር ተነስተን ነው። ለምሳሌ አንዳንድ ትረካ ላይ መሀል ላይ ናሬተሩ ይገባና ይህም እግዚአብሔርን ደስ አላሰኘውም ብሎ ይነግራል ለምሳሌ። ስለዚህ we have to understand that event from the narrator's perspective ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ we have to follow the narrator. so the narrator በጣም ኢምፖርታንት ነው ማለት ነው። ለምሳሌ የኢዮብን መጽሐፍ ስናነብ the narrator ሰማይ የሚሆነውን የሚያውቅ ሰማይ የሚሆነውን ነግሮናል። በሰይጣንና በእግዚአብሔር መካከል ያለውን ኮንቨርሴሽን ነግሮናል። ስለዚህ እኛም ያን የኢዮብን መጽሐፍ ስናነብ የራሳችንን በኢዮብ ቦታ እያስገባን ወይም በኢዮብ ፐርስፔክቲቭ ምናምን ለመርዳት ከሞከረን እንደዛ ማድረግ ሊጠቅም ይችላል። እንደዛ ማድረግ አይቻልም ማለት አይደለም። ግን ሊተላለፍ የፈለገውን ዋና ድረስ ማድረግ ከፈለገን ናሬተሩ ከሚያውቀውን ነገር ሁሉ እንደሚያውቅ ሰው ነው የምናነበው ማለት ነው። ሰማይ ያለውን ኮንቨርሴሽን እንደሚያውቅ ሰው፣ እግዚአብሔርን ዓላማ እንደሚያውቅ ሰው ሆነን ነው ማንበብ ያለብን ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ዘናሬተር ኢምፖርታንት ነው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ናሬተሩ ከምን ፐርስፔክቲቭ ነው የሚነግረን? ለምሳሌ ናሬተሩ የሆነን ነገር ኃጢአት ነው ብሎ እየነገረን ከሆነ ስቶሪው ያንን ዲሞንስትሬት ለማድረግ የተጻፈ ከሆነ you have to understand that within that framework ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ዘናሬተር ሴት ያደርጋል ባውንደሪያችሁን ማለት ነው። የትኛው ካራክተር ጋር አላይን ማድረግ እንዳለባችሁም ናሬተሩ ሴት ያደርጋል ማለት ነው። ኤኒዌይስ ፍሎት አለው፣ ሴቲንግ አለው ናሬቲቭ፣ እነሱን እናወራቸዋለን በዲቴል። ሶ ናሬቲቭ ኤለመንት አለው as I've said. The first one is the setting ወይም መቼት የሚባለው ነው ማለት ነው። When you read a certain story of the Old Testament, it's important to understand the setting. The setting doesn't always have to be spatial or temporal. Oftentimes it is spatial and temporal. Oftentimes geographical እና temporal የሆነ setting ነው የሚሰጣችሁ። ግን sometimes it's theological, sometimes it's contextual የሆነ setting ሊሆን ይችላል የሚሰጣችሁ። ስለዚህ ናሬቲቭ ሀፕን የሚያደርግበት ቦታ ማተር ያደርጋል። ሀፕን ያደረገበት ጊዜ ማተር ያደርጋል ስቶሪ። ስለዚህ whenever you are reading Old Testament stories እና Old Testament narrative, it's important that you understand the setting properly. ምንድነው ሴቲንግ? be it a theological setting, be it a spatial setting or a temporal setting, it's imperative that you understand the setting ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ you have to so the setting is presented to us in the narrative as well, right? The narrative itself tells us the story. We don't have to dig up complex thing in order to identify that, but the setting really matters እና the setting ይረዳል። ለምሳሌ think of the book of Ruth for example. the book of Ruth ሲጀምር ሴቲንጉን ነግሮን ነው የሚነግረው አይደል? መቼቱን book of Ruth chapter 1 ምን ብሎ ነው የሚጀምረው? ሞገስ can you read it? book of Ruth ሩት ምዕራፍ 1 አንብበው እስቲ። ቁጥር 1
ሩት ምዕራፍ 1 ኦኬ
ቁጥር 1 ብቻ
መሳፍንት በሚገዛ ቁጥር 1 ብቻ መሳፍንት በሚገዛበት ዘመን በምድሪቱ ላይ ራብ ሆነ።
yes በቃ yeah that's enough. so this is the setting እየነገራችሁ ነው። ይሄ አሁን የምነግራችሁ ስቶሪ ሀፕን ያደረገው is in the time of the judges. It's when the judges were ruling in Israel ብሎ ነግሯችኋል። so that's the setting. It's both temporal and it's both spatial, but within that temporal and spatial boundary comes a lot of other presuppositions as well, right? ስለዚህ በመሳፍንት ጊዜ የምታስታውሱት ምንድን ነው? አሁን መሳፍንት በሚገዙበት ጊዜ ብሎ ሲነግራችሁ what do you remember from the time of the judges? we don't know the time of judges was chaotic, right? ሁሉም ሰው በአይኑ ልክ የመሰለውን የሚያደርግበት ዘመን እንደሆነ አይደለ? በእስራኤል ላይ ንጉስ እንዳልነበረ፣ በእስራኤል ላይ ኦርደር እንዳልነበረ የሚናገር ጊዜ ነው። ስለዚህ ይሄ ኢቨንት በዛ ጊዜ ነው የሆነው ብሎ ሲነግሯችሁ ስትፈቱትም ያንን እያሰባችሁ ፍቱት እያለ ነው። ስለዚህ አሁን የታሪኩ ዋና ዓላማ አንድ ሩት የምትባል ሴት ቃሏን አከበረች፣ ቦዔዝ የሚባል ሰው የነበረበትን የመቤዠት ኃላፊነት ተወጣ ምናምን የሚል ድምዳሜ ብቻ መሆን የለበት። ይሄ የሆነው እስራኤል እንደ ሀገር ታማኝነቷን በተወችበት ጊዜ ነው። ሁሉም ሰው እንደፈለገ በሚያደርግበት ጊዜ፣ ምንም ሪስፖንሲቢሊቲ ባልነበረበት ጊዜ፣ ሰው በአይኑ ልክ የመሰለውን ነገር በሚያደርግበት ጊዜ ሩት ግን ታማኝ ሆነች። ሩት ታማኝ ባትሆን የሚጠይቃት በሌለበት ጊዜ ማለት ነው። ሁሉም ሰው ታማኝ ባልነበረበት ጊዜ፣ ሁሉም በአይኑ ልክ የመሰለውን በሚያደርግበት ጊዜ፣ ፕሮፐር ሊደርሽፕ በሌለበት ጊዜ፣ ስፒሪቹዋል ሊደርሽፕ በሌለበት ጊዜ፣ ፖለቲካል ሊደርሽፕ በሌለበት ጊዜ ሩት ዋዝ ፌስፉል እያለ ነው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ለኮቨናንት ፌስፉልነስ የእሷ የፌስፉልነስ እንዲገባን is setting the time to us ማለት ነው። በዚህ ጊዜ እኮ ነው የሆነው እያለ ነው። ለምሳሌ ልም ባለ ራብ ጊዜ የሆነ ራብ ጊዜ ላይ ሰው የሆነን ጀነረሲቲ ቢያደርግና ደግሞ በጥጋብ ጊዜ የሆነን ጀነረሲቲ ቢያደርግ ተመሳሳይ የሆነ ማለት ወይ ስለዚህ ሴቲንግ እንደዚህ ሴት ያደርገናል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ when it comes to for example the book of Ruth, it tells us that this amazing thing, the faithfulness of Ruth, and not only Ruth but Boaz as well, This happened during the time of the judges. Remember that the time of the judges was chaotic and everyone was doing what felt like the right thing for them. So there was no judge, there was no arbiter of truth, but Rose and boys decided to do the right thing, even though there was no one to enforce it. ስለዚህ the story will have a different weight ማለት ነው understanding the setting will help us appreciate this ማለት ነው so think of root for think of Isaiah chapter 6 for example so Isaiah chapter 6 ኢሳያስ ምዕራፍ 6 ምን ብሎ ነው የሚጀምረው የሚያስታውሰው አለ የሆነ አንድ ናሬቲቭ ከማንበባችን በፊት ሴቲንጉን ነግሮ እንጀምራል ኤግዛክትሊ ንጉስ ኦዚያን በሞተበት ዓመት እግዚአብሔርን በረዥምና ከፍ ባለ ዙፋኑ ላይ ያየሁት ብሎ ይጀምራል he is telling you the setting ስለዚህ አሁን የሚሆነው ሴቲንግ የሆነ በሆነበት ጊዜ የሆነውን ነገር እየነገራችሁ ስለዚህ ሴቲንጉን ኢንቨስቲጌት እያደረጋችሁ ስታነቡ ማለት ኦኬ ንጉስ ይሄ ኢቨንት ንጉስ ኦዚያን በሞተበት ዓመት መሆኑ ምንድነው ኢምፖርታንት የሚያደርገው ብሎ መጠየቅ ማለት ነው what makes it significant በየር ንጉስ ኦዚያን የሚወደድ ንጉስ ነበር የእስራኤልን ቅጥር እንዳደሰ መከላከያ እንዳበጀ የተነገረለት ንጉስ ነው ኢቨን ዞ በህይወቱ መጨረሻ ያው እግዚአብሔር እንደተዳፈረ ተስተውሳላችኋል ቤተ መቅደስ ውስጥ እንደገባ ከዛ በለምጽ እንደተመታ ከዛ ውጭ ግን የሚወደድ ነው ከዛ አንድ ሰው አስቡት ከ16 ዓመት ጀምሮ ከ16 ዓመት ጀምሮ ለ52 ዓመት ያህል ሲገዛ ስለዚህ he is a king he is a big figure in Israel he is a prominent figure እሱ ሲሞት ነው የሚለው ስለዚህ የእሱ መሞት you can imagine that it was a traumatic event right it was a big deal especially in the context of Israel he was a beloved king he was one of the good kings for example try to remember what happened in Ethiopia when the former prime minister died when Prime Minister Meles died everyone was in shock right everyone I was a bit young and I only remember partially but I do remember that everyone was shocked and everyone was in sadness in a way everyone seemed like I mean I am generalizing when I say everyone but most people seemed like they lost a relative I know this happens whenever a prominent person dies everyone will be shocked and that was the kind of environment that was created in Israel as well so Isaiah tells us that in the year that the king Uzziah died he saw God and the way he presents God is in a kingly manner right እግዚአብሔርን ከፍ ባለ ዙፋን ላይ ያየሁት ማለት እኮ ያው ንጉሱ በሞተበት ዓመት ሌላ ንጉስ አየሁ እንደማለት እኮ even though King Uzziah died even though the king you respect the king you love died I have seen the real king and he is still in his throne እያለ ነው ንጉሱ ቢሞትም እንኳን ይሄኛው ንጉስ ግን አሁንም አለ እያለ ነው ማለት ነው hence to appreciate the imagery that Isaiah gives us in chapter 6 it's important that we understand the temporal setting of it ማለት ነው hence setting is important in order to understand narrative so when you are reading a narrative investigate the setting whenever it's presented to us so if the author has decided to tell you the setting be it a literary setting or a temporal setting or spatial setting a geographical setting try to investigate it try to investigate why is this important why is this setting important let's investigate ማድረግ ማለት ነው hence when reading Old Testament narrative in addition to the other exegetical steps we've already discussed it's important that you pay due attention to the statistics as well ማለት ነው so the next thing you need to investigate is what we call the plot of the narrative plot ማለት ሴራ የሚባለው ማለት ነው as you know most narratives and OT narrative for sure follows the same pattern so let me open painting So you can see my screen, right? So every plot follows this kind of structure, parabolic kind of structure. So we will have the climax of the story up here, climax. Then we have exposition somewhere here. Let me use text. We'll have exposition here. We will have climax here, and we will have resolution here. So exposition is what we call things like setting. For example, the author will introduce as the setting, and I forgot an important aspect that we call conflict. We will have a conflict somewhere around here. So every narrative is designed in such a way, right? We first will have an exposition. The author, for example, will give us the setting, will introduce characters. ለምሳሌ ልክ ቅድም እንዳየን ንጉሥ ዖዝያ በሞተበት ዓመት ይህን አየሁ የሚል ናሬቲቭን ፕሬዘንት ሊያደርግልን ይችላል። But then you will have a conflict. ምን ማለት ነው? ስቶሪው ወደ ክላይማክስ እንዲደርስ የሆነ ፕሮብለም ኢንትሮዲውስ ይደረጋል። ይሄ ኮንፍሊክት doesn't always have to be a negative thing. It might be a question, it might be an unanswered question. That in Genesis 12, in Genesis 22, the conflict is that God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, right? ስለዚህ አብርሃም ህይወቱን እየኖረ ነበር። ከዛ እግዚአብሔር ይመጣና ልጅህን ሰዋልኝ ብሎ ይጠይቋል። ኮንፍሊክት ኢዝ ኢንትሮዲውስድ ማለት ነው። ከዛ በኋላ አሁን ይሄ ኮንፍሊክት እንዴት ነው ሪዞልቭ የሚደረገው የሚለው ነው ናሬቲቭን ጋይድ የሚያደርግልን ማለት ነው አይደለ? ስለዚህ ዛትስ ኮንፍሊክት። ስለዚህ the question to be solved, the question to be answered, the problem to be solved is what we call the conflict ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ there will be an exposition. In the exposition aspect, it's pre-conflict የሆነ discussion ማለት ነው። It could be an introduction of character and things like that. But conflict will introduce a problem that needs to be dealt with ማለት ነው። It is the main thing that leads that progresses the plot ማለት ነው። ፕሎቱን የሚያንቀሳቅሰው ዋና ነገር ኮንፍሊክቱ ነው። የአብርሃምን ታሪክ ስታነቡ ከዛ በኋላ ኦኬ ልጁን ሰዋልኝ ተባለ። ከዛ በኋላ የአብርሃም ጭንቀት ጉዞ እሱ ሁሉ ኢትስ አባውት ዘ ኮንፍሊክት ራይት ሃው ዊል ዛት ኮንፍሊክት ቢ ሪዞልቭድ ማለት ነው። ከዛ በኋላ የተለያዩ ኢቨንቶች እየመጡ ይህንን ሴራ እያከረሩት ይሄዳል፣ ከፍ እያለ ይሄዳል። ለምሳሌ ቲንክ ኦፍ ዘ ኬዝ ኦፍ አብርሃም። ከዛ በኋላ ሰዋልኝ ይለዋል። ከዛ በኋላ ጉዞ ይጀምራሉ ራይት ጉዞ ይጀምራሉ። ከፍ እያለ ይሄዳል ማለት ነው ስቶሪ ዘ ፕሎት። ከዛ በኋላ ይስሐቅ መሀል ላይ ጠይቀዋል፣ ምን ሰዋው በጌታ አለ ይለዋል። ከፍ እያለ ይሄዳል። ከዛ ይደርሳሉ። ከዛ ያስረዋል። ከዛ በኋላ once when it feels like it's going to break in a way ወይም exactly ሞት ነው ብላችሁ ስታስቡ then there will become a resolution right መፍትሄ ይመጣል። ከዛ በኋላ ስቶሪው እየቀዘቀዘ ይሄዳል ወደ ኮምፕሊሽን ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ዚስ ፓራቦሊክ የሆነ ስትራክቸር ነው ፎሎ የሚያደርገው ሁሌ ኦቲ ናሬቲቭ። hence identifying these elements is important in order to understand all the summit narrative, because identifying the conflict will save you from exploring unrelated subjects. For example, you can read the story of Abraham. Mogus, mute your mic. For example, you can read Abraham the story of Abraham and Isaac, and for example postulate about the relationship between Abraham and Sarah. You can mix that story about, for example, their relationship, their marital relationship, for example. But that would be wrong, right? That would not be the right way to read that. That would not be the right way to read that specific narrative. The right way to read that narrative would be to focus on the actual conflict. to actually focus on the main issue ማለት ነው። The main issue in that narrative is the conflict, and that conflict is the fact that God has asked Abraham to sacrifice his son for him. So you need to focus on the conflict, and you need to find the climax. Oftentimes, the answer, oftentimes, the main point of the narrative revolves around the climax. The main point of the narrative revolves around the climax. You need to identify the climax. Where does the story take the turn downwards ማለት ነው። እየከረረ ሄዶ ከዛ በኋላ ሪዞልቭ እየተደረገ የት ጋር ነው ማለት ነው። ክላይማክሱን አይደንቲፋይ ማድረግ ማለት only that you'd also identify events or characters or that thickens the plot. So if you are, for example, preaching on an Old Testament narrative, your homiletical points, your sermon points, those points ማለት ነው። In order for example, you would when talking about if you are speaking on a point by point approach, if you follow a point by point approach, the points that form your homiletics, your preaching, would be the things that thicken the plot ማለት ነው. And your main point, your the main point of your homiletics, your sermon will be the climax and the resolution of the plot ማለት ነው. Means you need to identify those points ማለት ነው. ስለዚህ when you're reading a narrative, in addition to identifying the importance of the setting, you also need to identify the exposition, the conflict, and the climax and the resolution ማለት ነው. Doing that will help you appreciate the importance of the ስለዚህ you need to identify. It's important that you do that. As I've already said, the conflict doesn't have to always to be a negative thing or an actual conflict. It doesn't have to be an actual conflict. It rather could be a question. It could be a pursuit. It could be, for example, a journey. You simply need to understand the main issue that's trying to be resolved ማለት ነው when trying to identify the climax. Okay, let's proceed. The next thing you need to take into account is the characters. You should identify the characters, the main characters in the story. So you would find different kind of characters in the Bible and in stories. And the common way to divide them is in three. The first one is what we call full-fledged characters or round characters. These characters are characters that you know a whole lot of things about them. You don't always know a single thing about them. You know, for example, about their strengths. You might know about their childhood. You might know about their growth. You might know about their about their spiritual journey and all that. So you know a whole lot of things about round characters. But if you are thinking about flat characters, for example, flat characters are known a single thing. Flat characters are known only by a single trait. For example, think of a character in Ethiopian tales called Mamo Kilo. You do know Mamo Kilo, right? So ስለ ማሞ ቂሎ ምን ታውቃላችሁ? ስለ ማሞ ቂሎ ብዙ ታሪኮች ታውቃላችሁ። ግን ስለ ማሞ ቂሎ ተናገሩ ብትባል ስለሱ ምን ብላችሁ ነው የምትናገሩት? ማን ነው ማሞ ቂሎ? ስለሱ የምታውቁት ነገር ምንድን ነው? ማሞ ቂሎን አታውቁትም? ኢን ኢትዮጵያን ቴልስ ስለሱ ቂልነቱ ብቻ ነው የሚታወቀው አይደል? In every story what's being emphasized is that he is a fool, right? Hence he is a flat character. Only a single trait about him always being emphasized about him. You don't know a whole lot about him, right? For example, think of Abba Gabrana, for example. What you know about Abba Gabrana is that he's shrewd, he's smart. That's all you know about him. So those are what we call flat characters. Only a certain trait or a certain type is being emphasized on it. But there are round characters. Round characters are ones that you know a whole lot about them. You know about their strengths, you know about their weakness. For example, think of King David. You know a whole lot about David, right? You know about his sins, you know about his righteousness, you know about his faith, you know about his kingship, you know about his shepherd. So he's a full character. That's a round character. And there are also characters which are called agents. Agents are ones only used to achieve a certain purpose. They don't really play a whole major part. For example, uh, for example, when you are watching a movie, for example, if it's a